Shaw Gowson. Gowson for yes, to be precise. This is the village of South Gowson in the northwest of the Isle of Lewis, the most northerly of the permanently inhabited islands of the Outer Hebrides. The house on the croft that you're looking at is at 58 degrees 26 minutes and 34 seconds north, 6 degrees 23 minutes and 37 seconds west. In effect, this is my natural and comfortable habitat. You might think this place is remote, but to me, this is home and the centre of the known world. It's the places that are further away from here and peripheral to my interests that are really remote. And like all peripheral interests, they appear tangential to the real world. This film, and the stories in the book that preceded it, are an attempt to immerse the self in the unique sense of place that can only be found at locations like this. This story is about what makes a place special. You could apply the same thinking to your own special place, but for me, Gowson is unique. In effect, this is a love story to a special place. Every place has a distinctive combination of distinguishing geological and geographical factors, wildlife, archaeology, and human history. As we travel from place to place, the emphasis of those interlinked factors will change, but they have an internal integrity that puts each individual location in a class by itself. Each place is neither completely identical nor completely different from any other superficially similar place. This, in part, is a voyage of discovery to help each of you identify and explore your own special places. For me, the sense of a place always begins with the geology. The solid stuff that we walk across, climb over, build our houses on, is the start of what literally shapes our landscape. Whether we can fully understand them or not, whether we can even see them exposed at the surface, the rocks beneath our feet tell a story about past environments and about the history of a place. Here in the Outer Hebrides, there is a lot of earth history. On this shore in Gowson, the rocks that we now see at the surface can be at least 3,000 million years old, possibly older in some locations. When these rocks were formed at extreme pressures and temperatures, they were 35 kilometres deep in the root zone of a mountain range probably as high as the present-day Himalaya. All those mountains have been worn away over many millions of years and the grit dumped into ancient oceans. Even more astonishing is the fact that at the time of their formation, the rocks of Gowson were somewhere down near the present South Pole. The shifting land masses of the continents have drifted slowly but inexorably over the surface of our planet, powered by the convection currents deep within the earth. Whenever I think about what makes a place special, I simply need to ponder over the mind-stretching environmental history of rocks like these. The subtle markers in the landscape that combine to create a distinctive sense of an individual location are not limited to the archaeological remains and the other effects of continuous human habitation. Although we humans might only be able to observe perhaps 1 or 2% of the comings and goings of the animal community that share this landscape with us, there's a continually restless activity. In the book, I called one chapter A Metropolis of Birds, because the seasonal movements of birds is one of the most obvious of those cyclic events that impact upon human communities. Each year, hundreds of individual birds of dozens of different species pass through this land. Some come to breed, some to rest over the winter months, and some remain all year round. They come from South Africa, like the corncrake, or the equatorial regions, like the tiny wheatear. Others arrive from and return to Iceland, like the flocks of redwings. Curlews breed here in the summer, when their distinctive cry hangs in the air over moorland edge-crofts. Few sounds define a place more than the creaks of a corncrake, the gentle single-note piping of the golden plover, or the frenetic screeching of a colony of terns. Some birds leave to wander the oceans for months on end, while occasionally exotic strangers like the snowy owl or the glossy ibis are blown off course from their usual habitats in the east or the west, and rest for a short time in Gausen before moving on again. The exact combination and timing of this avian mixture varies throughout the years and from place to place, and that's another factor that contributes towards establishing a unique sense of place. Nor is it only the very ancient rocks that make this landscape special. Looking down from the village towards the shore, the land dips to the flattish strip along the coastline. This is land that is literally at the cutting edge of science. In almost every other part of the coastline of the Outer Hebrides, the raised beaches that were formed following the melt of the ice load were stripped away by subsequent glacial movements and dumped far offshore. In Gausen, apparently, the raised beach was almost uniquely protected because the basal ice sheet froze to the land, the moving ice cracked and the ice slid within itself to leave those loose sands and gravels in place. This shoreline still has much to tell us about glacial geomorphology. On top of these rocks and on top of this raised beach, whole civilizations have arrived, lived their lives and departed. This is an intimate and continually changing landscape in which remnants of past communities coexist side by side with our present lives, and in doing so, they contribute to the Gaelic concept of buntaness, which is a deep connectedness and sense of belonging to a personal network of people and places in the total heritage of an individual. Some of the earliest inhabitants left neither their names nor their languages, but the marks that they left on the land for primitive agriculture, rudimentary drainage and dwelling structures are still evident. There were human waves of migrants, the Gaelic-speaking Celts, who have intimately named this landscape, but also Norse seafarers who came in conquest but stayed to settle and contribute to the regional gene pool. Their legacy is also visible in many of the place names and in the archaeological remains, as well as the beginnings of recorded history. On the landward side of this old farm wall, the foundations of a 1,000-year-old Norse village lies buried beneath the croft. On the seaward side, the stone-built structures of an older Iron Age village are gradually and intermittently re-emerging from the shifting sands. Broken pottery with rudimentary decorative markings is regularly found, and occasionally a human skeleton is uncovered to reveal fragments of another strand contributing to the story of this place. Despite what the metropolitan media might say, this township is not remote. This community is central to the lives of the people who inhabit here. 1,000 years ago, this village and others like it were in the mainstream of European sea traffic and significant centres of Celtic and Nordic culture. Many of us believe that they still are. Nearly 4 decades ago, I found a treasure while walking along the coastline of my village. Originally, I thought it was just an old penny. It's about the same size. When I looked more closely, however, I noticed a small, pierced protuberance on one face, like a button might have. When I turned it over, a complex Celtic design was apparent. When this was sent away for analysis, the object was found to be an extremely rare enamelled bronze harness mount about 1,000 years old. The intricate Celtic pattern was inlaid with bright yellow and red enamel, so old that it has devitrified. In the analysis, A trace of zinc impurity was found in the enamel, but not in the metal of the mount itself. Only 2 similar harness mounts have been discovered previously, one in Norway and the other in the Isle of Man, both in Viking graves, confirming the trading link between the west coasts of Ireland, Scotland and Norway. The Norwegian discovery contained the same impurity in the decorative enamel, suggesting the tantalising possibility that the 3 mounts might even have been made in the same workshop. This provides one of the fascinating links between the Western Isles and the Northern Isles that's worth exploring further. Although only a few of the original standing stones remain, recent archaeological evidence suggests that the standing stones of Stennis inspired the inhabitants of Lewis to emulate their impact by erecting copycat monuments at Callanish. The later monuments at the Ring of Brodgar and throughout the north and west are a result of the cultural sharing by those early settlers, which suggests a greater geographical mobility than we usually give them credit for. The internationally famous Neolithic settlement at Skara Brae, which was dramatically exposed by a coastal erosion in 1850, is simply a fortuitously well-preserved example of the habitation of that prehistoric period. The remnants of a similar historic settlement at Gausen have been more intensively savaged by the elements, leaving less physical evidence to admire, but such are the ravages of the millennia. In nearby Stromness, I talked with historian and storyteller Tom Muir about one of his special places in Orkney.
My special place in Orkney is the Valley of Rackwick in Hoy. It's ridiculously beautiful. It's where Orcadians go on holiday in Orkney. George Mackay Brown, the poet, described it as the Valley of Light. Red sandstone cliffs rear out of the sea, steep, beautiful. The boulders on the beaches are striped like a boiled sweet. And the sand there is pink and it sings when you walk on it. It's the most beautiful and romantic place, although it would have been a hard life there. The crofters didn't have very good soil and it was very steep and they relied a lot on fishing. But it's the place that I chose to propose to my wife. And how could she say no with all of that backdrop? All my family history is from the North Isles of Orkney. I was born in East Mainland, so I have no connections with the South Isles, but other than just the first time that I went there, being absolutely breathtaken by the beauty of the place and how special it felt. I mean, it was a real feeling of magic and wonder in the place.
Back in Kirkwall, I called in at the Institute for Northern Studies of the University of the Highlands and Islands to meet my friend and colleague Professor Donna Heddle to explore her fascination with the landscape and culture of Orkney.
Well, my special place in Orkney would be the Nap of Hurra. Orkney is a landscape that's had human stories written on it and erased throughout the passage of time. And the Nap of Hurra isn't a palace or anywhere grand. It's 2 oval rooms on a little island off a little island in the north of Orkney. And people have lived there for 5,000 years. It is the oldest freestanding structure in the Western Hemisphere. And empires have risen and fallen and the tide has ebbed and flowed and people have gone about their business there. And that's what makes Orkney so special. It's a living landscape. It carries the stories of the people, the land, the animals, and the history that goes with it.
But those places are not the main reason I'm in Orkney. Across the 4 causeways that link the mainland of Orkney to the much smaller island of South Ronaldsay is a contributory part of my Buntiness that is not in Gausen. In the graveyard of St Mary's Church, along the area of the southern coastline, in a place called Berwick, I found the graves of my great-grandparents and my great-great-grandparents, who lived here in the closing decades of the 1700s. My family lived here for more than 200 years. For at least 3 generations they firmed at banks, on the rolling cliff tops looking across the Pentland Firth to the north coast of mainland Scotland. It looks green and fertile now, but it must have been hard work in the years before mechanisation. In the farmyard, recent archaeology has uncovered the remains of a chamber tomb, the so-called Tomb of the Otters. People have been living and loving on this land, in fact actually in this land, for at least 5,000 years. Perhaps a direct, unbroken link with my own people. It's an awesome thought that plays with my imagination. From the top of a nearby hill, it feels significant that the landscape indicator emphasises that it is 450 miles from this point to London, but only 312 miles to Bergen in Norway. If we look at these two maps of Gausen, we see a dramatic visualisation of the waves of humanitarian disaster that swept the Highlands and Islands of Scotland during the mid-1700s to the late 1800s. In this first map from 1853, although the village of South Gausen has already been turned into a small farm, the adjacent village of North Gausen is shown, by this row of black-coloured buildings, as being inhabited. In this second map, from 1895, the same buildings are depicted as a row of empty white rectangles, because the village was cleared of its remaining inhabitants in 1863. The people were evicted and scattered, some simply to adjacent, already overcrowded villages, other families to North America and beyond. The township of Gausen had been emptied of its residents and turned into a tenanted farm. The anguish of that dispossession was captured in a poem by John Graham, one of those villagers who was cleared and immigrated to Canada with his family, where he died, still pining for Gausen.
Geol de siamel an siolgain, an biach na siol cura, is rein na canach yn cwn and gyn lan y dŵn hort o gynnu. Mae'r pag sy'n siasa, le sy'n iasg von y dŵan, no le crwn yn y rioch, chadjig sgribag et dŵntje. Sam volloch yn unan I geol sy'n, ed ar ffogryga alabe, is de megniach va toesoch no de geil sy'n moenig sy'n dan amoch. En maat de eering ku zontocht, naulein ku farake, jousie balle dudde en jering, var en duas sy'n chele ku fallalein. Jalles at vojoch, is I en doorte ku guanoch, le ku chrein agus roop en tolle cholige guanlein. Jousie ferrend Columbus, en een toerist belooi, var ne skap sy'n ule maar vuhkes gulak, juiuskelig.
In the archives of Tasclan and Yellin in Stornoway, historical researcher Juliette Depordet introduced me to some fascinating documents that add a powerful commentary on that episode. The rent book of the estate of Lewis and Harris lists line by line the financial debts of the crofters and the rent arrears of the last families living in Gausen, until in 1863 the final chilling lines are written. Reading those words today, although we already know the story, brings home the horror of the clearances, the forced evictions of an entire village of decent but impoverished citizens, and the immigration to a foreign land they had never seen. Yet this is not ancient history. This is only 3 or 4 generations ago. My great-great-grandfather on his scrap of farm in South Ronaldsay died only 13 years before Gausen was completely cleared of its crofting inhabitants. For the first time in perhaps 5,000 years, the indigenous community in Gausen were no longer permitted residents, and a tenant farmer from mainland Scotland was installed by the estate. The unbroken line of community in this location reaching back beyond recorded history, had been brutally severed. Special places in the local environment, such as Toblevriege, the so-called healing well of St Bridget, and the temple of Champel and Crowneuve on the Galshan shore, both places with an ancient importance predating their adoption by Christianity, were robbed of their cultural significance. From the ruined dune in the village, from which at least 4 other of these enigmatic structures could be seen in the surrounding township, the community of humans had been torn from the landscape. Throughout my home territory in Lewis, there are patterns in the landscape and in the heritage of the people that have a mirrored familiarity to me when I visit Shetland. Perhaps even more so than in Orkney, there is something in the DNA of Shetland that stirs me. This was reinforced for me when I went to speak with Dr. Ian Tate at the Shetland Museum.
Anybody for Shetland, they know that the closest islands to ourselves, historically, culturally, is Orkney. However, that's to miss a whole lot, because if you're a Shetlander and you go to the Outer Hebrides, you'll see a landscape which is far, far more similar to Shetland's than ever Orkney is. To me as a Shetlander, the Outer Hebrides, it's similar enough to be familiar, but at the same time it's different enough to be intriguing and interesting. You very frequently ended up with similar artefacts. The items themselves might look exactly the same. I've seen their equivalents in the Hebrides to Shetland, and they're so similar to our ones, but they're not quite the same. And that's what I love about comparing the Hebrides and Shetland. What I like about places is that they can be visually attractive. There's an island on the northwest part of Shetland called Vementry. I absolutely love that place because it's unspoilt. It's been unoccupied for about 150 years or more. There's everything from Neolithic tombs to First World War gun emplacement and everything in between the two. I love that. And in a wider sense, I have an attachment to the area that I'm from. I have a strong sense of belonging to a place, and I definitely belong to the northwest corner of Shetland. It's an emotional attachment, in the same way that I love Vementry for the visual appeal. There's a genealogical, certainly emotional attachment that I have to that area of Shetland.
That sensation that Orkney and Shetland are closer to the Nordic heartland than they are to London was magnified when I spoke to Dr. Andrew Jennings, Associate Professor of Island Studies at the University of the Highlands and Islands.
It's actually the whole of Shetland that appeals to me, and it's because it's in the north. It feels as if it's in the north, 60 degrees north is the same as Cape Chidley in Labrador, Helsinki, to the southern coast of Greenland. So it's an authentic northern place. Big skies, strong winds, Norse heritage, and pretty much everything in the rest of Scotland and the British Isles is to the south. I think one of the things that really stands out are the place names. The place names in Shetland are all, or pretty much nearly all, of Old Norse origin, and they really give you a distinctive feel, and Scandinavian friends who visit Shetland are always impressed that they can understand what most of the place names mean.
These interconnections between Shetland, Orkney and the Hebrides are shared experiences of the sea and the land, of settlement and clearance, of human culture and the natural environment, were highlighted nicely for me by Dr. Beth Mowat, the Director of Island Strategy at the UHI. She reflected on the subtle distinctions between the 3 groups of islands.
I'm fortunate that I get to travel around different islands, and you always find that there's a sense of similarity. There's more that draws us together as islanders than that separates us, and I'm quite interested to see the parallels and the similarities that living in an island shapes you. with. And that's not just about the challenges of getting on and off, it's about that sense of place and how that shapes you as a person in a community and your outlook in life. My favourite place in Shetland is probably the coast. It would be hard to pin it down to one specific place. As a child, there was a place near my family home called the An, where I would go and sit for hours. And it's one of those places where you could walk past it and miss it. But when you get down there, it's a fabulous place. And I like that sort of idea of these secret places that only through that connection with the landscape you actually know that they're there. And there are many of them around Shetland. But for me, that the coast and that connection to the sea and the relationship between the sea and the land, and how important the coast is as an islander, that there are many threads and layers to that relationship between the sea and the land in a cultural context, but also in a very real and present context for modern islanders as well.
Just to the south of this location, below the beautiful coastline around St Ninian's Isle, is the beach of Quendale Bay, where historically an invading party of Lewismen fought and were massacred by the local Shetlandic Norsemen. Their graves are still marked in this landscape. South of this again is the complex settlement of Jarlshof, which exhibits human settlement from prior to 2300 BC continuously through the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, the Picts and the Norse, and was still inhabited in the 1600s. Thousands of years of history are condensed in Jarlshof, within an acre or so. In Gausen, the habitation of the human community extends in time both before and after the settlement at Jarlshof, but it's not clustered so spectacularly in the one location. Rather, the scattered evidence of the prior civilization is extended across a wider landscape, requiring patience and effort to rediscover today. The social history of Gausen from the late 18th century onwards is more readily accessible, and at times has even featured in breaking news stories across the UK. In this courtyard, in the closing years of the 19th century, there were dramatic and sensational scenes that were reported in a series of journalistic dispatches to newspapers throughout the UK. It must have seemed like revolution was coming. In his testimony to the Commission of Inquiry into Crofters and Cotters in 1884, and what became known as the Napier Commission, John MacDonald gave evidence of the continuing desire to move back to this settlement, to move back to Gausen, and to repossess the land that they felt belonged to them. When the commissioners asked him if he would like to return to North Gausen, he replied, "I would have some furniture there before evening, if I got it." 4 years later, in 1888, this farm courtyard was temporarily a military encampment. The continuing land agitation was resulting in land raids and civil disobedience in various locations all across the Highlands and Islands, and Gausen was in the front line. As tensions escalated, a company of the Royal Scots and a detachment of Marines were sent to Gausen. 2 supporting gunboats arrived in Stornoway, and 200 extra constables were promised from England if required. The French Revolution and the American War of Independence were barely a generation previously. Ireland was in the grip of the Great Famine and increasing civil unrest. The authorities were taking no chance that disturbances in Gausen would spread. Despite the arrest of 4 local crofters and a highly public trial in the High Court in Edinburgh, the men were found not guilty of being part of a riotous mob and returned home to a hero's welcome. The disruptions and land agitation continued, with only a short break for the agonies of the First World War, until in 1921 the land occupied by Gausen Farm was taken back by the government into crofting tenure, and the farm was broken up into 52 crofts for young families. As this film is being released, we are approaching the centenary of the resettlement of Gausen and the rebirth of Gausen as a living, vibrant community. Change is ongoing, of course. Neither landscape nor communities stand completely still. And in 2007, Gowson became one of the 22 villages in the 56,000-acre Gowson Estate Trust, covering the northern area of Lewis, to bring the land under the ownership of the entire local community. This brings us to a situation in the present day that the cleared people of Gowson, the immigrants and those shunted into neighbouring townships, the raiders who were taken to court and the families who supported them, could never have imagined in their wildest dreams. The burning flame of Dúchas, the inalienable belief of the Gael, in the heritable right for the people to occupy the land, has come full circle. Whatever the future may hold, for the first time in history, the democratic decisions of the resident community are in the driving seat of change. There are many different aspects of a place, different attributes and physical characteristics that combine to make a location so uniquely memorable that it secures a special place in our consciousness. In the high Himalaya, there are several isolated valleys called Baal that are revered as extraordinary places, even sacred locations. In the introduction to a book about one of those Baal, called Pemmico, the Dalai Lama has written, "Sacred environments such as Pemmico are not places to escape the world, but to enter it more deeply." In my worldview, that statement could also be applied to some small islands, and within those island communities, there are comparatively few but significant sites that combine the exceptional environmental, social and cultural attributes that mark them out as distinctively special places. Gowson is one such place.